You're listening to the 2020 Nelson Arts Festival Pukapuka Talks. This session, Fleeing to Freedom, features Behrouz Boochani and Golriz Ghahraman in conversation with journalist Anke Richter.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much for joining me in my conversation with these two exceptional people who I think we're not just lucky to have on a stage tonight, but in Aotearoa. So. Golriz Ghahraman was born in Iran to progressive parents left-wing progressive parents who joined the revolution to overthrow the Shah, and then were later suffering from the suppression of the Islamic regime there. Made it to New Zealand when Golriz was 9 years old, were granted asylum here on arrival. She spent her teenage years around and on K Road. Despite that, she became a human rights lawyer. Worked on UN tribunals around the world, joined the Green Party, and then 2 years ago became the first New Zealand refugee ever to become a member of Parliament. Where are the books? Oh, here, right. So this amazing memoir, which I just finished, Know Your Place, is deeply moving and personal and raises questions around belonging and identity and diversity. Behrouz Boochani was also born in Iran and is a Kurdish journalist. When the Kurdish magazine that he founded was raided in Tehran, he fled the country, made it to Indonesia overland, and then finally across the sea, almost drowning twice. And instead of entering Australia as he had planned, he was detained on Manus Island for 6 years. From the camp, he secretly wrote articles about riots, torture, hunger strikes. He made an undercover documentary, and he wrote his book, No Friend But the Mountain, on his phone, sent out by WhatsApp message after WhatsApp message. This book is incredible. It's powerful and poetic. It won the Victorian Prize of Literature and is now going to be turned into a film. And last November, as many of you know, Behrouz arrived in New Zealand with an invitation from the Word Christchurch Festival. And then in July this year, he was granted asylum, finally. Which means he's finally a free man and safe here. So welcome to both of you. The session today is Fleeing to Freedom. So obvious first question is, what does freedom actually mean to you? Let's start with you, Golriz.
E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā karangatanga maha, tēnā koutou katoa. I think it is really important when we have these conversations in particular to recognise our own place in Aotearoa and the colonial history and the fact that we sit on land that was never ceded. So I think that's what I'm kind of much more come to terms with since I've found my place as a refugee here. I was taught growing up in post-revolutionary Iran that our people were suffering from imperialism and equality meant equal access to our own resource and also democracy. So I think, the plight of the people of the world across the global south is connected, and I think of freedom as being a really global thing, if it's a construct or if it's a reality that we think of. So I feel free here because we have a democracy and we have sort of formal equality, but I think that my sort of plight can't be separated from what's happening in Iran and what's happening in other places where refugees emanate from, because there's a reason that refugees exist. So we have to kind of dismantle all of those systems before we can be truly free.
Great. Behrouz, freedom.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, I think my understanding and definition of freedom should be very different with people in New Zealand, because in whole my life, I born in a dictatorship system, in a religious dictatorship system, and I grew up in that. But that dictatorship system, for me, as a Kurd, as a minority, definitely was worse compared to other part of the society, other groups. So I think, yeah, and I left Iran. I left everything, and I just came to Australia. So because of freedom, and we can say that in whole my life I have been impacted by this concept. So it's very different, my understanding. And then I was detained in a prison in a remote island for 6 years. And then I came to New Zealand. So we can say that that experience, of course, was a huge experience. And again, changed my mind, my understanding of freedom. And when I came to New Zealand, so people said, oh, you are free now. But that was another step, because I had to process that. I had to understand this freedom. So it still continues. So it's very different, you know, it depends to my life, my experience. And, but I think freedom is a concept that needs to be understood. You know, people should understand it. And while you are not aware of that, actually you are not free. And I don't want to, it's probably many people hear this, it's like a cliche that you say that, oh, I was in prison, but you can be free in a prison. But really, that is true, you know, because when you are in a prison, you know, the jailers cannot actually detain your mind, your soul. And that is my experience, because through that experience, in the end, I challenged the whole system. And I think that is, that is interesting. When you are in a prison, you are in a cage, and you challenge that system, the whole system, you know, and you feel, even when you are inside the cage, you feel that you are a free man. But I mean that generally, if I compare with New Zealanders, you know, I think the people of New Zealand, many of people really are not aware of how they are free.
Do you know what's really interesting to me is now there's a lot of conversations globally happening around freedom of information and like fake news and democracy being undermined. And when we were growing up in Iran, because we're roughly the same age, that was just accepted. It's just so funny to me that people talked about that openly, like, well, what does the news say? Well, who wants us to believe that? Okay, now we have to listen to BBC Farsi. Okay, what did they want us to believe? And so, like, constantly looking at the motives behind the information that we're receiving, because it was a dictatorship. So in a way, people were much more astute, and they were much more sort of critical and free in their way of thinking and assessing information. But something else that Behrouz has just said that was really interesting, I think, that people forget about us, those of us who are from places like the Middle East, and, you know, it applies to the whole of the global south, whether it's the giant, you know, continent of Africa or whether it's the Middle East, is that, you know, we're both part Kurdish, and you know, Behrouz is Kurdish, and he was involved in the freedom movement there. My mother is Kurdish, and so there's this concept of being a minority within a place like Iran. There's religious minorities, there's linguistic minorities, there's oppression happening at different levels. and we have different culture, our culture has a different relationship to gender, whether you're Kurdish or whether you're, Shia or Sunni or whatever it is, and people don't think of us that way as Middle Easterners often, whereas for you, you've brought the fight of a Kurdish journalist to a Manus Island prison, and that's much more your identity than being a refugee. But people don't kind of see it. They see refugees as being a mass of people and Middle Easterners as a mass of people, and the Middle East doesn't even exist for us. We're Asian.
Can I quote from your book, Golriz? Because you're always labelled as a refugee writer and you're labelled as the refugee MP. So in your book you called it a dirty, scary label shared with those faceless hordes breaching pristine Western borders. So how do you feel about this refugee label?
I own it because I realize that there is, it's very complex, and we were just talking about this earlier. It is, people call you a refugee and they associate it with a dark mass, hordes of people coming and they're breaching, the white shores of whatever it is. But actually, and it's so complicated to try and explain it every single time, but it's anyone who we've collectively decided should be free from persecution based on your race, religion, political beliefs, or nationality. It came from the Holocaust. So refugees are people who have survived something that we all collectively think every single human being deserves to survive. But there's shame attached to that. There's even shame in our own communities. And I realized when I first ran and this label was coming out and I was being described as a refugee, even my dad, pulled me aside and he said, "You don't have to say that you're a refugee. You were just a child. We were the refugees, And then now you talk, and I realized he was even ashamed of this, whereas I think of it as something that he achieved. He wasn't willing to raise a little girl in oppression when he was back in Iran. He wasn't willing to just accept the theocracy. My mother wasn't willing to accept the theocracy. They fought back, and then, the people back there oppressing them should be ashamed. But then I realize now, as people call me a refugee MP, and I hopefully you think of that as being empowering to others from that background, but sometimes members of that community kind of talk to me in our own safe circles, and they say, "We're not refugees, we're former refugees, we're New Zealanders now." And absolutely that's true, but sometimes identity comes from the outside. We can't help that. And so to me, leaving a void, if I don't use it proudly, I know that the people attacking us will still be using it. The Australian government will still be using it to fearmonger. There's going to be shock jocks on radio still using it. We've had something happen here that's been the biggest hate crime in New Zealand's living memory not that long ago, and that was in part driven by the fear-mongering against the Muslim community, of course, but because of that xenophobia that comes with some of that kind of anti-refugee rhetoric. So I'm trying to develop a different relationship to it in the public consciousness, because and people sometimes used to ask me when I campaigned, how do we help other people assimilate as well as you have? And and I would go, well, what makes you think I'm assimilated?
Right.
And their answers were always things like, well, you're educated, you're a woman, you dress like this. And I would go, well, I get my feminism from people who face tanks for equality. I get my commitment to democracy or human rights or whatever it is from people who had to face torture for it. And so if that changes people's minds, if they look at me and they look at Behrouz and they go, oh, that's a refugee, that's okay. Like maybe we're going to make it a little bit better. But
You're already touching on something that really stood out for me in your book, the perception of how backwards your parents would have to be because of where they've come from, this generalization and the stigma, and I could really feel that, how you were pushing against this stereotype. But Behrouz, the whole refugee label and the refugee writer, I know you've struggled with that a bit as well, right?
No, actually, I think refugees, so my experience is very different with Golriz, and I think most of the refugees, I think they struggle to get distance from that label, that concept, and actually most of them, they really don't want that people call them refugee. And I think they are right, because when you become a refugee, you lose your identity under that concept. You just become a refugee. For example, so when I was in Iran, so I had a normal life like others. So I had a job, I had family, I had, simple thing like others. And I was a journalist. And when I became a refugee, in 24 hours, you lose all of this, and you just become a refugee. And if I talk about my works in Manus Island, I feel that all of my works were struggling to get my identity back, to that people accept me as a human, not under that concept. And now that now I'm not, legally I'm not a refugee anymore, but my understanding of this concept and this label is that I want to get distance from this, but in other side, I feel that I have responsibility towards this, and I have some responsibility towards those 6 years of fighting and struggling to challenge this, to challenge the power structure. So it's quite paradoxical. And in other side, with my job as a writer, as a novelist, people expect that I just write about the refugees. But now I'm working to challenge this narrative towards the refugees, and that's why I work in the university with the artists, but in other side, as a writer, and people expect that I write another book about my life in New Zealand. I said, no, I'm not.
You're not a professional refugee. You're
I'm
a professional
not 80
writer.
years
Right?
old to write about my biography. So what I'm doing now, actually, I finished this.
Go.
That now, as a writer, now I am working on a collection of short stories which are completely different. It's fiction about anything.
Love.
Yeah.
Love. About love.
Because people expect that I only write about this. I had a conversation with Tara June Winch. She's an Australian novelist. She's based in Paris. So we were in an event in London, online. Here, she said, so her works, she's an indigenous, Australian indigenous, and all of her works are about, the historical trauma of indigenous people in Australia. And so now in Australia, everyone thinks that she always should write about indigenous. But now she is writing a love book, which happened in Switzerland.
Behrouz.
So
yeah.
it is quite paradoxical. I want to get distance from this, but I should do some work.
It's a fine line to walk, huh?
Yeah.
How to
But
do
you
the
get
right thing.
criticized either way.
Yeah.
Because, if I talk about refugee issues, it's sort of, or migrant issues even in my work, and that's a portfolio that I hold. Well, I did hold. We'll do portfolios in 2 weeks. It becomes, you're being self-serving. No one says to the bankers they're being self-serving when they comment on the economy, eh? But it's sort of, it's that thing, and like if you're Māori, you can't talk about Māori, but then if we talk about something else, it's kind of like, well, what right have you got to come in here and why are you criticizing our justice system or all of the other portfolio? So it's a little bit, you're blocked in, what they actually want is that we be good victim witnesses when someone else wants to draw on our experience and then just quietly merge. We're not gonna. Or some of us will.
For both of you, arriving at Auckland Airport was life-changing. I mean, you were only 9 and you were 36. But your first words, Behrouz, when you arrived were, "I survived." So maybe you should explain that a little bit.
Yeah, actually that moment was very difficult for me because actually I was almost crying, but so in Australia people imagine me as in a different way, as a tough guy. But it was very emotional for me, and that was a personal. It was very personal. It was related to 6 years writing, because for 6 years I was just writing, publishing, just to expose that system, and I didn't have this chance to look at the past. And when I arrived in the airport, because it was a very dramatic journey, it was very difficult.
19 hours.
Yeah, so I can talk about that if you want.
It's a long trip.
Yeah, very long trip, even in the airport in New Zealand. So when we arrived, just all of the passengers, so there were 3 lines. So those people that most of them went in a line. Some, they were quite suspicious, they were in that. And some that...
It's the customs line.
Yeah, custom line. Some that they were very suspicious at them and I was the only person. And when I arrived there, so many journalists and people were at the airport. They were waiting for me. I think you can talk about that. Yeah, I was there for, I think, 25 minutes because they look at my bag. So I had invitation as a writer, but my bag and my thing, I was carrying rubbish things, like broken papers, something that I wanted to bring from that prison. So I was not like a writer, but I had invitation. And my passport was different, so they were suspicious. So when I arrived there, actually that moment was the first time that I became sure that I passed that border, It was the first time that I had this free time to look at the past, because my journey started from Iran. So after 6 years, finished in that moment. So exactly, because it still was possible that they deport me before I passed that line, So that's why for the first time, I had this chance to look at the past, because people ask me, and people say that, what is your feeling? When I arrived there, the journalists say that, And just I said, yeah, let me have a cigarette. Yeah.
Of course,
Yeah, it was.
as you do.
Yeah.
That wasn't even his first words. His first words was, "You're Kurdish too,"
Yeah,
as I was said.
Oh.
But it was, and then it was like, "I'm not racist,"
yeah.
but it's the kind of anyway.
It's a little in-joke here. Yeah, but let's look at the past, even though it's a pretty horrific past. But you were in confinement, detained on Manus Island unlawfully detained for 2,269 days, under conditions that the United Nations and Amnesty International have described as amounting to torture. And you yourself, in interviews and your writing, you have said the so-called offshore processing centers, very fancy name for what you say is actually worse than a prison. What's made you come to the conclusion this was worse than a prison?
So I think, that is a long.
It's a long discussion.
huge
Maybe just
discussion
personally,
about
what were
this.
your experiences?
I'm not going to talk only, about that experience. So mostly I would like to talk about my works. That my works, actually, if someone read my articles that I wrote there and the book and other works, I wanted to challenge the narrative towards the refugees. And the main thing for me, and still is important, is the creating our own language, creating our own concepts, a language that represents our situation as a refugee who were detained in that prison. So when I am talking about this language, I mean a part of it is imagination towards the refugees. How people, when they hear about refugees, they imagine the refugees. So unfortunately, before I come to Australia, so this language that I'm talking about is a language, is not only the government, even the humanitarian organizations, because there is two perspectives towards the refugees. First is the government and their supporters, the power structure. They categorize the refugees, in Australia mostly. They look at the refugees as people, as rapists, dangerous, terrorists, They always talk about the refugees in this way. That's why they are able to justify this barbaric policy. And in other side, opposite of this, the humanitarian organizations and some journalists, they have a romantic imagination about the refugees, and they categorize the refugees as an angel.
Angels, yeah?
Yeah, but we are not angel, Yeah, so, and I think in all my works, I tried to create our own language, to challenge these two perspectives, to challenge, to create our, because I believe that we should challenge the narrative through this.
And actually, this is the most important thing, I think, in terms of the lessons for us in Aotearoa, in any Western community that wants to be inclusive, is that it's about giving us, if we're talking about refugees, humanity. And that means we can be diverse. Within us, there is diversity. We have personalities, we have agency, we have, birthday parties, and and we are journalists and artists, as well as not talented in particular at all. But actually, we and this is what I had to grapple with when I first started to publicly identify as a refugee, is that people want the model refugee when they campaign for doubling the refugee quota. And it was uncomfortable for me, because actually you have a right to be free from torture whether you go to Oxford or if you're a writer. You shouldn't have to write an award-winning book on WhatsApp to get off Manus Island.
Can I quote you? There's a great sentence in your book. We don't have rights because we're good, but because we're human.
Yeah.
That's from this book. There are many good lines like that in there.
It's
Yeah.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it goes for everything. It goes for, you don't have to have your children in wedlock to get a basic social safety net. It's what human rights are about. We don't have rights because we're good. Prisoners have a right to vote because they're human, not because, anyway, all of the things.
Totally. Behrouz, you spoke about becoming this voice or getting yourself into the conversation, not just being the subject, the refugee that others look at, but the one who can actually speak for himself. But that took a while, right? Did you ever, was there a time when you weren't sure whether the Western world out there would ever listen to what you had to say?
Yes, so I think that is very important because people look at the end of the story. The end of the story is that someone, as a writer, come to this country, and when he come, the camera, the people are in the airport, and he had a press conference there and talked towards the media. But that is the end of the story. We should go back to 7 years ago, to six years ago, to 5 years ago, that how this journey, this struggle, so...
They laughed at you
Yeah,
when you said, I'm a
and
writer.
my
You're right.
biggest,
Yeah.
actually, so the government, the power structure, we know them. That was Peter Dutton, Scott Morrison, and the government, and they said these people are terrorists, they are dangerous, and we put them there. But the main struggle was not only against the system, was against firstly with the journalists. The journalists who I approached them, so I smuggled the phone in and I started to communicate. But I was a refugee, and in their imagination I was nothing, and they didn't accept me as a journalist, And I had to work for many years that these people respect me as a journalist, actually acknowledge me as a journalist. And sorry that I talk about myself, it is an example. It can happen for any refugee or any the minority. In West.
Yes, we're
so
not
it can
seen
be
as
with
agents.
women too.
Yeah. And you have
women,
to prove yourself
still
so much
women
harder.
are struggling, So it took a long time with the humanitarian organizations. So I have many examples. So it took a time that I challenged this, and it took 3 years, 2 years that even these people accept me as a journalist to publish my works,
And that's the systemic prejudice. So it's that thing where we're not often the authors, we're not behind the camera, we're not holding the purse strings, we're not on boards, we're not represented, but sometimes our stories are told. So we get to, we're not the agents, but we are the subject, and it's degrading as well. And I think it often leads to our stories not being told in a way that is humanizing and empowering. So the stories that get chosen to be told are about victimhood. So, as a Middle Eastern woman from the so-called Muslim world, my story would be presented as someone who's been liberated from her culture. Whereas if I was telling my story, it would be that story of, actually my culture is what taught me the importance of democracy and feminism, because actually, oppression exists there, but actually feminism is also ours. And God forbid you're a man from the Middle East, then the story is that you are the oppressor, you're backwards, you're all of the things that Behrouz has just talked about. But we don't get to, that's the symptom of us not being often the storytellers, the agents, the political analysts, because of course you can analyze the political situation in Australia, which led to Manus Island being, and you do so very astutely. I can talk about things other than refugee issues as a politician, but we're not often seen as that. We're kind of accepted only as witnesses again. So, and I think we do need to think about that in New Zealand as we come to kind of learn the lessons of, Christchurch and kind of weave that into our systems. Who are the storytellers? Who are the analysts? Who are the experts? And then who are the victim witnesses?
Yeah.
So, I think I should add this, that at least that happened for me. So the imagination towards the refugees, the whole narrative towards the refugees in Australia, I'm talking about Australia. I think it will take time that I know different layers of New Zealand. So in Australia, and generally in West, the imagination towards the refugees is that the refugees, in the advocate groups and humanitarian field activists, they think that the refugees are voiceless, and we want to be their voice. So I challenge this. That no, we have our voice, and we are not voiceless. Just you.
Give us the platform.
Yeah. And so creating that platform took such a long time. And after that, they said, okay, so you are a witness. A witness. For example, we had an event online in Australia long time ago, years ago. And in that event, they invited me so I could reach to that stage. They invited me to that event, and so they asked me that, okay, Behrouz, you talk about what is the current situation there. And I said, okay, I talk about the current situation, but I have something else to say. And they had two others in the panel. And so they wanted that just I be a witness. And I said, why I should be a witness? I've written about this issue more than all of you together. All Australia together didn't write about this issue as much as I wrote. We want to be a part of the main discourse. The main discourse. And we are the owner of this discourse through our experience and our work. So that's why I think that is important. It's like that we see, always I share some example about feminism, because feminism now is become a more public culture, and people can really understand it more.
I think we're all feminists here on this stage, right?
I'm not sure.
Oh, okay.
Just I'm joking.
Behrouz,
I
sorry.
think just go. I think I said what I wanted to
There's
say.
so much we could talk about for hours, I know. And I was going to ask you all these things about your childhood and your past, and of course about Manus, but I think your book is an excellent way to understand.
I'm sorry, this book sometimes really, I say to my friend that sometimes I wanted to bury it in front of the camera. Why? Because the media, that is another part of this narrative. The media and people are interested to reduce 6 years struggling and writing against that system to challenge this actually narrative. I was not writing report. I was writing opinion piece. to challenge the narrative. They reduced all of these 6 years to only a book. It means that I was sitting there, and 6 years just I was writing this book. That they reduced this work to only a book, which, in my opinion, really, this book is not my main work. You know?
Watch the documentary. Chauka, Tell Me the Time.
Yeah, I
Read
think
the
that
articles.
that
But
work is better.
what I'd like to do, because
Yeah.
like you said,
Yeah,
if
I'm
you want
sorry
to
I
find out
talked too
about-
much, but I
not
had
at
to say
all.
that.
But if you want to find out more about Manus, Behrouz time, Manus, and in general about the camps there and everything, there is a lot to read out there, not just Behrouz's book, but also all his articles and so much more.
And
But
others, not
let-
only me, many
and
people
others.
write
But
about
let's
that.
talk
place.
about, okay,
Yeah.
let's leave the past with the books for now. But let's talk about just what has happened recently for both of you. Golriz, you were called A Threat to Freedom by David Seymour 2 years ago, with some pretty devastating consequences for your life. So can you just tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, so I was elected into New Zealand's Parliament in 2017, as you said. But as soon as I put forward my candidacy, and it was in sort of January 2017, such as the lengthy process of list ranking in the Green Party. And so I had sort of 7 or 8 months. And it was interesting to me, though not enormously surprising, and everyone who's from a particular type of marginalised community knows this, that there was prejudice in the way that my candidacy was received. Someone figured out that I'd be the first ever refugee MP, and there was Donald Trump's Muslim ban was happening, and Brexit had happened the previous year. So I got, and I was talking about this earlier today to some young people, and it was, I want to acknowledge this for people who are from different, from marginalised and minority communities, that our stories and our faces are received very differently by different people. And some of it is a lot of love and a lot of support and a lot of, you're inspiring, but a lot of it is hate and prejudice and fear. And I started to receive that almost immediately, including threats of gun violence. And so I spoke about this in my maiden speech, and I wanted to speak about it in Parliament specifically because I saw it as being the cause, as being the political discourse sometimes, on both sides of the house, and not just for me, not just for refugees. That wasn't my focus. I was thinking also about, our sort of East Asian Chinese communities. They get a lot of threats and racism, and there's all sorts of different communities here that have to face that, whether it's Māori, Pacific, we all get seen as a different type of stereotype, and it's damaging, and often it's politicians that scapegoat us and for their own political gain, and I wanted to say that in that house, and so I spoke about it, and I spoke about the threats of gun violence, and that the fact that and at that time there was also, Winston Peters was sitting there, and then 18 months later, Christchurch happened. And I'd realised, I hadn't been taking it seriously. I had been talking about reforming hate speech laws, protecting young people in online spaces, and all of these things that I felt like I had a responsibility as someone who had that lived experience now for the first time sitting there to talk about. And then Christchurch happened, and there was that outpouring of love across this nation for all of the impacted communities, but what I think didn't get seen per se was that it ramped up the racist attacks. Because there was that moment of absolute love and support, and then that was perceived as threatening to those little dark corners of the web or our communities.
There was a backlash, right?
Yeah, they retaliated.
Yeah.
It got scarier, and you can imagine it actually got so much scarier because now our communities knew the end point. And I'm in a very privileged position in that I have a home and I have language and I have means of, getting security or whatever. And a young hijabi woman walking down the street with her kids to school, or an elderly Muslim, and it wasn't just the Muslim community, it was, because this is a racist attack. I mean, the Sikh community came under attack straight afterwards as well. So, you know, that was all happening, and then suddenly a prominent politician was on national radio bringing up the fact that I'd spoken out against hate speech and called me a threat to freedom. And we know those types of, that kind of language is, you know, used in some of those white supremacist circles. So immediately, actually, it was the Prime Minister's office who was sort of like, yep, that language is really threatening, and we sort of started to get more threats, and I had to go through the police, and I had to have security,
Panic button.
Yeah, panic button, and security, like escorting me to and from, you know, because Wellington's scary because you have to be, well, you have to be at a certain place at a certain time, and you leave at 10 p.m. and everyone knows where you are, and it's dark, and, you know, it's not scary normally, but it got scary. But it's that politics of fear and othering that we absolutely can't tolerate anymore, but yeah.
I don't want to leave it on such a
don't.
sad note, because that is actually really sad, but we've only got a few minutes left, so before I have my last question for Behrouz, we have a few minutes left for questions, so those of you who have a question for Golriz or Behrouz, please come up to the microphone in the meantime, while we're still talking, and queue up. And yeah, Behrouz, you had a bit of a similar situation that you became a political target as well earlier this year, just before you were granted asylum, when you were called a queue jumper and an overstayer. So what was that like for you?
I used to politic. I was born in politic. I grew up with politic as a Kurd. And you know, in Iran, most of people, actually everyone, are engaged. And it was really nothing for me. Yeah, I didn't care really.
Can we address the queue jumper thing? We can
yes,
clarify
please.
it.
Yeah.
Because I just promoted this event online and got the queue jumper thing come up, and I just realized, okay, it's just a regular reminder. And it's not for all of you, self-selecting good people, but it's that thing that somebody has used this language of there's a queue and people have jumped the queue, and it's really resonated with people who don't want to admit that they're anti-refugee or they're anti a particular race, so they always go back to the queue, this imaginary queue. And it doesn't exist. There is no queue. And the reason there's no queue is that the Refugee Convention and the fundamental right to seek asylum has come out of the Holocaust. At that moment in time, they turned ships back to Nazi, Europe. People who had actually escaped were turned back because they hadn't gone through the process or whatever. They'd just escaped because they had to. And so the definition comes from that. Persecution is defined based on that. That's what we have to prove in the system that we've gone through, is you have to prove that type of persecution. For us, it will be either ethnic or political belief in terms of my family. But you don't turn people back because there's no queue. It's a needs-based, emergency-based system.
Thank you for clarifying that. I think it's really important. You could do a whole seminar here. Are there any questions from the audience?
Behrouz, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you. Accept my accent. First thing, you almost ruined my night by mentioning Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton.
Yeah.
Second thing is, what would you tell Australia about their future? There are a lot of Australians who do not fit into the two categories. Many of us offshore don't particularly own up to being Australian now. For some of us, it's been 20 years since Tampa was turned back. We're angry.
What should I say to Australian?
Thank you,
Yeah.
yes.
That's the question, yeah.
I think I have said many things to Australian over the past year. But it's very interesting. Just a few days ago we had, because now UK, British, they are going to actually use the same policy. So they look at Australia as an example to banish the refugees to some islands in, yeah. So we had a conversation with Guardian in UK just a few days ago, and exactly we were talking about this, and they asked me, what is your message to people in UK, and I think it's very interesting about Australia, because still in Australia people don't know that when we are talking about this policy, it's not only a matter for refugees, and even it's not a matter only for Australia, because when some countries, some places, if you look at climate change is a global issue. So human rights should be like this. When that happened in Manus Island, in Nauru Island, and Australia has done that, if you look at Australia now, actually they didn't only damage the refugees, they damaged their reputation internationally, and important thing, they damaged the principles. They damaged the political culture in that country. They damaged the values, humanity, the principles that actually why we believe in democracy. Democracy is a culture, is not only a structure. Democracy is a culture that you respect diversity, you respect the minorities, you respect people. Democracy is that, and you respect the values, humanity. So what's happening in Australia now, they have damaged the political culture, the democracy in Australia, So when you are silent in front of this, when you are silent when they are torturing refugees, when they are just banish people, innocent people, and keep them in detention for many years, and the kids and women, actually, those people, those politicians still are running Australia, So you cannot treat others in the wrong way and come back at home and you treat your family in the right way, You bring that violence into your home, and that's happened in Australia. That's happened in Australia, and that's why we say that politics is broken in that country. And I'm really, it was the first democratic election that I witnessed in all my life. In New Zealand. I couldn't vote, but I was following. I am really happy for New Zealand because that election actually had a big lesson to other countries, to Australia. It was a lesson, really.
Can we take one more question, Kerry?
Yeah, it is a lesson. It is a lesson, a beautiful lesson, that you can have an election, and just in end of that process, just everyone accept that, and you don't lose your principles. And compared with Australia, they become a negative example. That is very important. It's but that's not mean that everything is perfect in New Zealand. Thank you.
Kia ora, assalamu alaikum to both of you, Golriz and Behrouz. Behrouz, it seems like you're more imprisoned in Australia than you are in your own country by the sounds of it. But my question is really, if you have opportunity now to write something lighter side of life, and if you're really free in your mind, what would you write? Question first to Golriz and then to you, Behrouz. Thank you.
Question to me as well? Mm-hmm. I'm not a writer. The reason I wrote this book was because HarperCollins approached me, and it was it was like 2 years ago. And I thought it was too early for me to do an autobiography, like I was too, fresh in everything and I was too young. But they sort of said, oh, you can do thematic essays that are based on your life, and I accepted that. But then when I started writing, it came out as an autobiography. But I felt like it was, the reason I said yes and the reason I wanted to write, even though I'm not a writer, is that I do believe, and this is a really core lesson that I've learned since I've been involved in politics, that and I was afraid of tokenism when I came in, and I was the refugee MP, and I thought really deeply about that and what that means when people think you represent an entire very diverse group. But I realized actually the more we tell our stories, the more people see our different faces, our different perspectives, the more the fear and the misnomers do dissipate. And there was no story when I was growing up, there wasn't a story of a young refugee background women growing up in Aotearoa, and so I wanted to add that to the repertoire that exists, tell my parents' story, present our life in Iran both as an oppressed dictatorship and as a place where people do question the news and are very political, and then what it is like for marginalised women in New Zealand growing up, and I guess the UN system is in there too. And politics, eventually. I wasn't going to write about politics, but I did write about politics once Christchurch happened. So I don't think I'm necessarily going to write something else. I think I'm going to focus on the defence portfolio and the justice portfolio and prisons and police in New Zealand.
I hope we're going to hear so much more from you, from both of you, not just about refugees.
They wanted to hear.
They wanted to hear as well.
Yeah.
No, I
No,
already
you should
mentioned.
answer.
Oh, did you? Okay.
Yeah, I
Yeah?
write novel and short stories. Yeah, but of course, in my journalism work, I write about refugees and marginalized people. To challenge the narrative, but I don't say it is impossible, but it's very difficult.
Both doing great work. Thank you so much.
Thank
you for
you.
being
Thank
here.
you.